Going to start a new series today. We'd been in the book of James and for several weeks, and we're going to just kind of spend some time, a few Sundays this summer, looking at some more doctrinal type messages, some stuff I haven't done in a long time, but I think things that will be a blessing, or I pray they will. This morning I was thought all week about how to kind of introduce today's lesson, and it kind of came out of a conversation that I had, believe it or not, with a man that, how do I say this without sounding judgmental, claimed to be a minister, and in a conversation, and we were talking, and he said, he asked me about the church here. And I tried to explain to him what we're about. And he said, y'all sound outdated. And I said, he said, you still have pews in your building? And I said, yeah. He said, why do you still have pews? I said, because they still work. He said, well, haven't you seen that the latest trend is these nice, new, comfortable chairs? I said, those would be great. But why get rid of these if they still work? You know what I mean? It's like, and not just that. To me, it just gets to the practical nature of why replace something that still works. Now, if we grew in number, we could get more in here if we went to the chairs. I know that. But right now, I look at it and I go, why replace something that... He goes, well, everybody that walks into a church building or assembly, if they see pews, they automatically think old and traditional and stuffy. And I went, okay. But it spawned some thoughts in the conversation that we were having. It spawned some thoughts of just how things have changed. And it was like this morning, I had gotten out of the habit of leading worship, and then when Colby moved and James led, and then James moved, and so we were going to try to rotate things, and and Brad had led the last 3 Sundays, and standing up there, I don't even know where that came from. Mark your hymn books. We haven't had to mark our hymn books in a long time. But where did that come from? Well, I was thinking about, how things change. When I first came here 18, 19 years ago, we didn't really have a good microphone system, and I would go home hoarse on many Sundays from trying to talk loud enough to make sure that everybody could hear me. And now we have a decent microphone. You can hear me. They're recorded. They're uploaded online. We didn't even have internet when I came here. And I was thinking about the story of how we got internet here. And that came about from me studying with Marion and Ora Cowan's daughter, who was living in Wichita, going to school at the time. And I went the day before Christmas Eve, had dinner at their home, studied with their daughter, and she said, I have so many questions I want to ask you. Do you have email? And I literally looked at her and went, what is email? And she said, and Marion goes, I'll fix you up. And he and Ora wrote the church a check and said, get internet and get email. And we got internet and email. And I emailed with their daughter for about a year. Just off and on. She was really struggling in her faith. And that was how that it came about that we had email. But how things change. Our culture is changing. Things are changing. Things are different. That sometimes we see how things are updating constantly. You get something and it's instantly obsolete just about when you leave the store because you're getting the new model and they're introducing the next new model. And bought a month or two ago, I had bought a new cordless drill, and I go in and I'm buying this cordless drill, and they've changed the batteries since the last time that I'd bought a cordless drill. And so I'm buying a new one, and I'm looking at that little battery, and I'm going, there's just no way. I mean, my battery was a huge battery, and they said, you'll be surprised, this battery will last forever in charge time, and you'll put it in your tool bag and you'll get it out and it'll still be charged, whereas those others will go dead. That everything is changing. And it started to make me think about things because of votes and things that are going on within other churches. That made the news yesterday. The Presbyterian Church took a vote and voted and probably going to split their denomination now. There is talk it could possibly affect Cup Ministry because one of our major supporters is a Presbyterian church here, and I know that there's been some rumblings within that church of what's going to happen and things like that. And it started to make me think, do we sometimes get the idea that the Bible is outdated, that Jesus is outdated, that God is outdated? And I thought, maybe we need to go back and just open our Bibles and just ask some questions, look at some things, and share together over the next couple of Sundays. And so we're going to talk about Jesus. Next Sunday, we're going to talk about the Holy Spirit. The Sunday after that, I believe we're going to talk about the gospel. And I've got the lessons laid out. I just don't know exactly what order. I do know that that's kind of the order that I'm going to do. And so today I want to just start with Jesus. Back to the basics. Who is Jesus? What is so important? What does it matter? Well, as followers of God, we understand that Jesus said some things, and so let's start with this idea first, and then we'll talk about who Jesus is and the importance of it. Jesus said himself in John chapter 14, and probably the most controversial thing Jesus ever said for our culture today. And Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me. Now, if you want to stir people up, you quote that verse. That will make people more angry than just about anything, because let's face it, people like Jesus, the idea of Jesus. Even the Muslim world likes Jesus, believe it or not. The Quran says he was a great prophet. They like Jesus. They like Jesus' teaching. The Quran is very favorable to Jesus. That people like Jesus. They like his teaching, because what did Jesus say? Probably what's the most famous thing that you can think of that's ever quoted that Jesus said? Turn the other cheek. Or what's another one? Probably the number one thing that is ever quoted about Jesus is, and when I start it, you'll go, yep, I know what you're talking about. Judge not, lest you be not judged. And people will say, you're judging me. And Jesus said, don't do that. Well, if you go look at the context of what Jesus said, that's not exactly what Jesus said, was it? Jesus says, don't you be judging people and saying they're doing bad when you're doing exactly what they're doing. In other words, don't be hypocritical in your judgment. And then Jesus does say we're going to make some judgments, because he says don't give what is sacred to the dogs and don't cast your pearls before swine. Jesus says there's going to be a time that you're going to make some judgments about people, that you're going to stop and you're going to say, wait a minute, is this person like that dog that if I don't give them what they want, all of a sudden they're going to bite me on the leg? Or are they going to be like the hog that you could put a nice necklace of pearls around hogs and they don't care? It means nothing to them. They'll still get in the mud. I've shared the story over and over again of being a boy growing up and taking care of our hogs, and one of my job was to wash their feed thing out and to wash their water trough out. And it was amazing to me to get that water trough up, spray it out with the water hose, put it back down, begin to fill it with water, and the first thing I knew, one of those sows would be right up there in the middle of that thing, standing in it, drinking, waded right out of pig poo and mud and everything else, right into their water, and then would pee in it or poop in it, and still standing there drinking it. And I'm going, why even bother? But my grandfather never allowed me to just refill it. It always had to be washed out. And I was like, they don't care. And he goes, I do. Refill it. So a hog does not matter. A pig does not care about having a pearl necklace. And so Jesus says sometimes you make those judgments. But let's think about who is Jesus. Jesus came to show us the Father. Now, if you begin in the Old Testament and you begin reading in Genesis, and you read Genesis all the way through, and you don't go to sleep in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you make it through Numbers, you make it through Leviticus somehow, and then you get into some of the exciting stories, and then you get to Job, and you hadn't lost your faith yet, and you make it through the Psalms, and you go to read the Proverbs, and you see how unwise you are in some things, and how much wiser you are in others, and then you get to Ecclesiastes, and then you read the Song of Solomon, and you're like, wow, that's in the Bible. And, and then you get to the prophets and the minor prophets, and you get all the way to Malachi, and you end with Malachi, and you end Malachi with a promise that one like Elijah is coming, talking about John the Baptist. And you get through all of that, and you see God. What we know about God from the Old Testament is that God could be angry. We learn that God could be wrathful. We learn that God could be merciful. We learn that God is the provider. We learn that God will feed His people, that He will make sure they have enough to drink, that God will provide for them, that God will see to their needs, that God will meet their needs, that God expects you to keep up your end of the bargain if you make a covenant with Him, that God will not keep up His end of the covenant if you don't keep up your end of the covenant, that God will allow you to go way into captivity, and He'll promise to bring you back in 70 years, and 70 years later you're being delivered. And you learn all about this, but the one thing that you learn throughout the Old Testament is you look at God and you go, He is fearful, He is scary, at times He is aloof, but you don't get to see Him. And then Jesus comes on the scene, because Jesus came to show us God. Begin with me in John chapter 1. Turn to John chapter 1. Now, if you've been here on Sunday mornings for Sunday school, you'll know that this is a text that we spent quite a few Sundays on. John chapter 1. Listen to what he says, beginning in verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now skip on down to verse 9. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through Him, the world did not recognize Him. And He came to that which was His own, but His own did not receive Him. Yet to all who did receive Him, to those who believed in His name, He gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. Verse 14, the Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. And we have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So listen to what He says here. He says, in the beginning was the Word. Now, too many times what happens to us when we look at this text is that we think He's talking about the Bible. We go, oh, the Word. Well, there are two different words used and translated for Word. One is rhema, which is the revealed Word. That would be what we read. That would be the Bible, the revealed Word of God. It's the revealing, something that is revealed. But here he uses the word logos. That it's more of a word picture. It's more of the idea of something being just shown. It's like in Southern culture, we speak in word pictures. It's like if somebody calls the church, I can always tell if they're from here or they're not when they call the church about Cup Ministry and they ask for directions. And I'll say, well, where are you? And they'll say, well, I'm in this part of Springdale. And I say, okay, come to this street and turn. And they'll say, okay, what's that close to? And I was talking to a lady the other day, and I went, wow, you've lived in Springdale a long time. And she was like, how'd you know? And so I'm telling her, and I said, we're close to the corner of 71 and Huntsville. And on the corner is Dobbs Motor Company. So you see Dobbs Motor Company on the corner, you turn there and you'll see the church. It's a big brick building and you'll turn in. And she said, that's that church that there used to be a chicken place and an ice plant. And I went, yeah, you're right. Because there used to be a chicken place right there, and there used to be an ice plant right there. And she said, now, when that chicken place went out, an RV dealer went in there. I said, yeah. She goes, I know just where you're at. I'll be there in a few minutes. I said, well, we're not open today. Oh, okay. Well, come Monday. She said, okay. That's Jesus. Jesus is revealing something to us in a word picture. Now, I've described it poorly before, but it just fits because if you grew up on a farm and you've ever heard a cow giving birth to a calf, it is a loud, bawling process that everybody knows about. When I was a kid, I grew up, and one time going into the chicken house, and I was pulling a feed cart between chicken houses, and just as I come out of one chicken house door, I didn't realize there was a red wasp nest there up under the eave of the chicken house. And when I came out the door and I'm pulling this feed cart behind me and it's rattling, it stirred those red wasps up. Those red wasps zeroed in on me. And they started up my back and they hit me up the neck and on the head. And I just dropped the feed cart and started running. And I'm running all the way up the path and I'm screaming just, trying to get loose because it just felt like they were just right after me. Kind of like the cartoon, the swarm just stinging, like a cartoon character. And I'm screaming and I'm running and I hit the back door of Granny and Granddad's house and I go running in and the back door of their house went through kind of a back porch right into the kitchen, which was real small. And I ran through the kitchen and into the living room and I'm just running around and I circled the whole house. And then I ran by Granny again and she was like, the second time she grabbed me as I go by and she just swings me around like this and she stops me and I'm screaming and she says, boy, you sound like you're birthing a calf. What's wrong with you? And I said, red wasp, And so then she grabs a hold of my shirt and pulls my shirt up, And she says, oh my goodness. She said, you run in there and lay down and I'll come and doctor you. And so And she says, you get in there on the divan. And some of you go, the divan? What in the thunder is a divan? That's a couch. All right. And so I get in there and I lay down, and she comes in there and she takes out this little round thing about this big, about that tall. And Janie's laughing because she knows what it is. And she peels it off and she puts it in her mouth. It was her snuff. And she gets her snuff good and she starts putting that on my red wine. She said, that'll draw the poison out. And you lay real still there, you know. And so my granddad comes in about that time, and he's mad. He's like, where's that boy? And she's like, well, he's in there. And he says, that boy took off, sounded like he was birthing a calf, said he was screaming at the top of his lungs. What's wrong with that boy? And he dumped feed everywhere out of that feed cart. And I've been down there cleaning up. What's wrong with that boy? And he had come in there, he said, he is in trouble. There's no sense in acting that way. Well, they had a few words and he left. He went to take care of the red wasp nest. They understood. Words, descriptions, describe things. You get a picture of something. Some of you, just by my telling that story, can see that. You can see me as a little boy running up a path. You understand it. Maybe some of you live something similar to that. What John tells us about Jesus, and he will spend the rest of the Gospel of John doing this, is he's saying if you see Jesus, you get a glimpse of Jesus by reading the Gospels, you see God. That Jesus is the word picture of God. So who is Jesus? He's God in the flesh, because he tells us, he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So he says, here he is. He was in the beginning. He wasn't created. He wasn't an angel. He is God's Son. He is part of the, I thought about preaching a lesson on the Trinity, but I realized real quick I'd split my barrel on that one. It's just not possible. It could probably be done as a study if we had 20 years to hide ourselves away in a cave somewhere and just talk, to try to understand the idea of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But He is God, and He's God in the flesh. And He's come down here, and He's made His dwelling among us. And our English versions don't do a real good job of describing what he says in verse 14, that Jesus has made his dwelling. And it says that he tabernacled, he tented among us. It was temporary. It's like when we go camping temporarily. We don't go camp to stay. Now, I know people, there's always the one person that will come to me after I say that and go, I could just live in a campground, I could just live in a tent, I could just stay there all the time. Most of us and most sane individuals like a roof over their head. They like all the things that a home provides or some kind of solid structure provides. But it's nice to sometimes go out, camp in a tent, live in a tent. It's nice. And then there's the idea of going home to a hot shower. There's no place like home. He says that Jesus came down here temporarily. He tabernacled. The tabernacle was temporary. The temple was meant to be the permanent building. The tabernacle was the one they picked up and moved. He says Jesus came down and He tabernacled. He was here for a short time to show us God. And that we could understand God. And there's so many things that I want to tell you this morning, and there's just not time. But if you'll go read Hebrews 2 and Hebrews 4 sometime, we understand that He became our high priest. And He came here and He walked on this earth so that He could understand us, so He could be a sympathetic high priest. Because we all want somebody that understands us. If we're unburdening ourselves to somebody, we want to unburden ourselves to somebody that really understands. If you're talking to somebody that doesn't even speak your language, it's like, huh? My neighbor came over yesterday. I was outside getting ready to cut some 2x8s, and I'm standing there at the tailgate of the truck, and I've got it all set up and the board marked, and I've got the saw laid out, and I hear my name, and I look up, and he comes over and he talks, and he says, will you pray for my granddaughter? And so I encourage you to add his granddaughter to your prayer list. Her name is Kendall Baker, and she's 10 years old. And it sounds like, from what he's telling me, she has some kind of form of leukemia, and she has been taken to Children's Hospital. She's 10 years old, and he was telling me as a grandfather, he's seen her less than a month of whole time in 10 years of her life. That there's just been a lot of pain and heartache. And he said, I came over to ask you to pray. And about 30 minutes later, after he just unburdened his heart, he goes, I just feel so much better because it just seems like you understand. And I said, I can't imagine that pain. And I said, well, are you going to try to go to Little Rock? And he says, well, we really can't afford it. And I said, man, I'll give you the money. You need to be in Little Rock. I will give you the gas money to go if you want to drive down tomorrow. And he goes, well, no, we can't tomorrow. Michael has to work and various things getting in the way. I said, you need to go see that grandchild. And when you get ready to go, I will give you the money to go. But I can't imagine that kind of pain. And Jesus came to show us God so that we can understand. Now, Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3 says some interesting things. I was going to quote it, but I want us to go read it. Go to Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3 and listen to what he says. There's so much I want to tell you, and we may have to make this 2 Sundays of lesson because I can see we're not going to get to all of it. But listen here to Hebrews 1 and verse 3. I love this verse. I'll let y'all get there because I want you to see this. The Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of His being, sustaining all things by His powerful word. After He provided purifications for sin, He sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. I love this. The Son is the radiance of God's glory. Now, in the Old Testament, there was this thing, the glory of God, is often called the Shekinah glory, and it's represented in. Remember in the Old Testament when in the book of Exodus when God sends Moses, the stuttering prophet, down there, and he goes to Egypt, and he goes in and he gives that 10-lesson study course to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh fails every lesson, throughout the whole thing. And each thing God says, here you go. And Pharaoh hardens his heart and hardens his heart and hardens. And he just fails the lesson. And finally, he goes, that's it. Y'all are kicked out of class. And so Pharaoh kicks them out. And they leave and they get outside. And God's leading them. And how did He lead them by day? There was a cloud. And that cloud was different than any cloud in the sky. It had a glory about it. And then at night, it was a pillar of fire. And it's called the Shekinah glory of God. And that's the term that he uses here. He says, if you see Jesus, you see the exact radiance of God's glory. Now, it's interesting, I've read a lot of Jewish writings, and in the Jewish writings that I've read, no one has ever historically of witnesses that wrote in the writings what little bit has survived outside of biblical stuff from the Old Testament of people that saw this pillar by fire and this cloud words cannot describe it. It's like people have tried to tell me about seeing something. You ever try to tell somebody something and you're telling them and you're just laughing, and you're describing this story and they're just sitting there giving you one of those. Ivan does this to me. I'll be telling Ivan something and Ivan will just be sitting there looking at me and I'll just go, well, I guess, Ivan, you just had to be there. That people that saw it and people that didn't, when they're trying to describe it, people are like, huh? And it's like, well, you just had to have been there. He says, if you've seen Jesus, the Hebrew writer tells us, he says he is the exact he is the radiance of God's glory. When you see Him, it's like all of a sudden you're seeing this fire in this cloud. There it is. And He is the representation of God's being. Now, those of you that have raised children, have you ever had a moment in one of your children's lives where all of a sudden you see yourself and you're like, oh Oh my goodness, what have I released on the world? Or have you had it in reverse? Have you ever done something talking to your children and you realize you're your parents? That's more scary to me. It's more scary to me than seeing my children act like me. The scary thing is one time when I pointed my finger at James, I know I've told this, but I pointed my finger at James and I realized, oh my God, I'm my father. Because I snapped my finger and I pointed at James and he melted and cried and went running away. And I went, there's power. That was yesterday. And I was like, wow. There is this, and Debbie says, she goes, you have that Bob Dickard look. Oh my God. God help them. Because I could get this look and she'll go, oh, you've got, oh no. That's Jesus. He says, Jesus, you see Jesus. Well, why did he come? Why did he come? Let's go to Colossians. So he's shown us. Who is he? He's God in the flesh. What's he doing here? He's showing us God. We're seeing God. We're understanding the radiance of God. We're understanding the very being of God. I realize we're just touching the kind of the little top of the iceberg here. Colossians chapter 1. Listen to what he says. Beginning in verse 15. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, for in Him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through Him. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything He may have supremacy. For God was pleased to have all the fullness of Him dwell in Him, and through Him to reconcile to Himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through His blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now He has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in His sight, without blemish and free from accusation. Now think about what He come. He's here. He's the image of God. He is the head of the church. He is, who is He? He's God's representative. He's God's Son. He is God's fullness. He is God's image. He reveals to us God. He heads up His church, and He paid for us. He paid for our sins by His death on the cross so that He could present us before God accusation-free. Now think about that. You know, I don't think any of us in this room could go to either our friends or family or something that somebody couldn't find something to accuse us of, right? Right? They're going to find a fault. They're going to find something they don't like. Right? It can just be the way you're being there. But when we come before God, because of Jesus, we are accusation-free. Huh? That's right. Accusation-free. He finds no fault in us because of Jesus. That's why it matters. That's why it will never go out of date. There's no expiration date on the message of Jesus. Let's pray together.